All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hagman. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Huge shout out to you guys on Apple, Spotify. You guys have really upped the ratings and reviews, so I appreciate that. I know I say that like intermittently. I'm like, hey, like just help me out, like throw me a bone, because it really does help with the algorithm. But appreciate the push from you guys. Really excited to see that. If you're from YouTube and you're wanting immediate access to these both long and medium form episodes, which if you follow the channel, Mondays, that's when we do the solo episodes. We have the shorter clips go out Sunday, Wednesday, pretty much the entire week. They're shorter, more digestible clips, which I understand. Like at times, it's been a different like season for me. Like I haven't listened to as many podcasts as I think I did at one point. But those shorter, those broken down clips, I mean, like I know for me as a listener, I'm like, this helps so much because sometimes I just don't have it in me for the hour, 2 hours, whatever it is. So if you're wanting those push notifications, obviously turn on notifications within the YouTube app, but hit that bell button and subscribe, and you'll be notified as soon as episodes go live. Now, with that, guest episodes. You guys have really liked the guest I've brought on recently, but if there is someone that you are dying for me to talk to, you're like, yo, like this would be a really sick collab, let me know. Let me know in the comments. Y'all really liked Liv Labrada, loved Eric Helms. I think at the time of recording this, Phoebe Hagen is the next individual who I will be bringing on, but I've got some really exciting guests to feature here soon. So stay tuned for that. The time of recording, I mean, I gotta be honest, like the last 3-4 weeks, been pretty rough for me. Like health-wise, had some pretty stark ups and downs. But we're finally finding some stable ground with the I don't know, I'll say recovery, with programming, with diet. So I'm hoping that leading into the holidays, I can make some meaningful strides and progress. But these things happen, and at this point it's like, okay, well, what are you gonna do? You gonna whine about it? You gonna be bummed out? You just gotta move forward. So that's what we are doing, onward. And I am excited to talk about this topic today because I think where a lot of you guys are at, I've had a pretty big uptick in consults recently. So individuals who are just meeting with me one-on-one, just one time, one-off basis, they're like, hey, want to sit down with you for 45 minutes, an hour, something like that, go over X, Y, and Z. Some of the consults are completely like devoid of PEDs. Some of them are strictly just like, hey, I want to go over my season design and get a better sense of if this makes sense. This is what my coach has me doing in terms of training. Can you work it out for me? Can you tell me like what are the big areas for improvement? If that's the case, I'm still accepting those one-on-one consults. But with that, I have been presented with just a higher volume of individuals who are like, yo, like, I know it's the holidays. I know fitness goals, like this is the time of year where people tend to drop off. I want to get ahead. I want to make up some ground because this year didn't go as I planned. And I completely get that. I totally understand. What I'll say is historically, I've dieted through the holidays. There are many Christmases, many Thanksgivings where I've been in the trenches of prep. Like I have been in no position to indulge. I've also had now a handful of Christmases, a few holiday seasons where I've been able to travel, been able to relax, been able to indulge. So I understand from both sides of the coin, like, the attitude, the priority shift, and for the individual who, maybe you're not in prep, but you're very much like, I don't want to fall behind. I want to hit the new year and then I want to get ahead. That's what we're talking about today. And it is actually that easy. It's pretty fucking easy to get ahead of most people. I mean, like I'm going to say like 99% of people are missing the mark on the big levers. And these are not revolutionary concepts. These are things that can be applied to business, can be applied to finances. But if you are someone who is looking to get ahead, this is going to start primarily with focusing on the most critical task. What is the number one priority? And if you don't know what that is, if like as I ask that, you're listening, you're like, well, I want to be a bodybuilder. Okay, let's break that down. And that's okay to have like a very general goal. I want to lose body fat. Cool. What is the most critical task? What is the thing that you need to do in order to achieve this? This is an ongoing conversation I'm having with clients as we're moving through different phases, is like, what is that primary goal? Especially clients who are going through a build, especially clients who are losing sight of like, why are we going through a build? Why are we in this like purgatory of a phase that feels like, hardly anything is happening? The reality is most people are going to get distracted by all the noise, by all the opportunities, and a lot of tasks that might, be of meaning, that might merit your attention, but they don't drive results nearly as much as that number one. What is the most critical task? So this comes down to prioritization and then commitment. So it's one thing to say, okay, like I'm going to segment out the most important things that I need to do. It's another thing completely to commit to it and to be like, yo, like this sucks. This is not what I want to do, but I'm going to do this thing because it's going to yield the biggest return. Now, when it comes to prioritizing your physique goals, whether you are in the bodybuilding space, whether you are just trying to improve your physique as a whole, there are several effective strategies to prioritization, but all of these strategies are going to help ensure that the resources that you have available are allocated to the most impactful activities. And the strategy that I like to use, like they've got tons of names in nursing. We call these ABCs. You can also consider like the Eisenhower matrix. So this is really just a tool. Like either tool, honestly, is just to help categorize what tasks are at hand, what task must be completed, and what is the urgency and importance. So dividing tasks this way, you essentially divide them down into four quadrants, or in the case of like ABCs, A, B, and C. So urgent and important. This is something that must be completed, and it's also relative to the time frame. So if we're talking about someone who's like, I want to build muscle. Okay, well then what needs to occur for us to build muscle? Let's start making a list of these things. And I encourage you to do this as you're listening. Make a list. Like, what is the overarching goal? And if you want to even go as simple as like, is it to get bigger or get smaller? Is it to get smaller but improve shape? So meaning like you want to lose body fat, but you don't know if like you have the amount of muscle that you need in order to like really have the curves that you want to have. Okay, cool. So it's lose fat and then probably end up needing to build muscle. If it's the other end of the spectrum, like, hey, I'm going to build muscle, that's the primary goal, but I know I'm going to then need to lose fat because I'm not at a body fat that I really like, that I feel the most comfortable at. Okay, so between those two, because most of y'all listening are going to need either a combination of both, because frankly, all of us can benefit from specific phases that are dependent on whether or not we are in a catabolic state or an anabolic state. Now, within these, we have to consider, okay, what are the things that allow you to do this? When we're talking about like daily practices, actions, okay, what are the things that are the most important that are non-negotiable? Obvious one, diet. We need to follow our diet. That's the action, that's the task, okay? So we can break each of these down into subtasks, okay? Do we need to follow a meal plan, or are we hitting our macros? So in order to do that, do we have a macro target? Do we have specific foods that we know, like, okay, there's 4 or 5 meals. We need to eat all of these meals at specific times. So under your umbrella of diet, really it comes down to what do you need to do so that at the end of the day, you can say, I was on track with my diet. For some of you, this might even be a little more fluid. This might be like, okay, I'm going to hit these macros and generally I can hit them however I please, but it's important that I stay within this range of, carbohydrates, my fats pretty fixed, as well as my protein, but overall calories are kind of based on how I'm feeling to some, with some regards to overall energy balance. Maybe you have some flexibility. Maybe for others, maybe if they're in prep or they just have a much stricter task at hand, it's like you have to eat these foods. You have to eat these foods and no other foods outside of these foods. Okay, cool. So we have very clear definitions of what is on track and what is off track. And I've talked about this in a few videos, is like knowing what is not adherent, what is not successful, what is deviation. Being able to clearly define that and know when you're doing it can really clear up, and I would say, I guess, tidy up some of the unintentional non-adherence that I think a lot of people accidentally, truly, unknowingly run into. So second big one is going to be training. And this is going to be something that predominantly, most of y'all listening to this, you have a specific workout that you're supposed to do. And maybe you're only given like a training split. Maybe you're given like, okay, you need to go train lower. Maybe you're given specific exercises. Maybe if you have a really good coach, they've given you specific sets. They've given you a specific rep range to work in. You know the right intensity. Maybe you have previous cues that you're supposed to be adherent. You're supposed to take the cues that your coach gave you in the training feedback last week and implement them. You're supposed to go revisit that video and be like, oh, she said to make sure that I'm practicing full foot pressure and keeping my center of mass forward. So when you go do your B stance RDLs, that's what's happening and you're not too far back creating negative shin angle. Maybe that is exactly what you're supposed to do, but you haven't been doing it. If you know generally how to be adherent when it comes to training, then it's very clear what non-adherence looks like. And again, with some regard, maybe some non-adherence is acceptable. Maybe you're in a phase where it's like, hey, you have discussed with the coach and it does make sense. There are going to be days where you do need to auto-regulate. Cool. Got it. Maybe that means on days where you're supposed to train lower, but let's say you didn't get a lot of sleep because you just flew back from Texas because your sister gave birth to her third child. So you know going into that lower session, like, hey, we're going to need to shift the focus to a lot of externally braced movements. We're not going to have a high degree of stability just going into these movements given like been under eating, under sleeping, stress has been higher because you've been taking care of your nephews. If that's the case, well, then you're able to make those modifications and it's not necessarily non-adherent. It is a modification with intention that probably was cleared by your coach. But overarching question we have to ask ourselves, is this task, is diet, is training, is taking your scale weight, is doing your cardio, is taking your supplements, are these things urgent? Are they important? And sure, I mean, you could get really granular and be like, which one is more important? Well, compared to what? But these are ones that within the sport of bodybuilding, you very much need to monitor these things and pretty much adhere to them and execute on them every single day. Okay, so what about important but not urgent? Maybe this is lab work. And some of y'all are gonna be like, whoa, lab work is super important. How is that not urgent? Yes, but I'm talking specific to that day. You might know in advance, like, hey, I'm supposed to get lab work 5 weeks after starting TRT because I need to assess where serum levels are at. And in that case, it is a medium priority if it's not the specified time in which you're supposed to get that lab work done, but it is something that you should schedule for later. It's something that you should be mindful in ordering the labs, scheduling the appointment with Quest or LabCorp or whoever the lab site is. This is something that you don't need to not train or skip your cardio or freak out because maybe that day, maybe it's 2-3 weeks in advance and you're like, well, I have to get this done. Well, maybe it isn't something that you actually have to get done. Maybe you have some buffer time, and maybe lab work isn't the best example. It is an example. It's the first example that I thought. Another one would be ordering your suit for your show. Maybe this is one that, you know, again, in advance, it doesn't have to be done this moment, but you do need to think far enough in ahead. You need to know, okay, by this date, I need to have done enough research. I need to have scheduled the initial consultation call with Toxic Angels. I need to know what kind of suit I'm getting. I need to balance out my finances so I make sure I can actually afford that suit. You have basically this idea of, okay, by this deadline, it is going to be urgent. But up until then, it is not an urgent task. So are we sacrificing essentially urgent tasks to do non-urgent tasks? No, we would never do that. Another example would be getting more comfortable with your posing. Would you ever be non-adherent or skip a workout because you're like, I have to go take this, I don't know, female etiquette class where they teach me to walk in heels? No, you never do that. That would be something, again, like you plan in advance. If you want to go do it, cool. But you fit it in. It's something that technically is a want. It is not a need to do specifically that day or even within the week, unless it becomes so problematic that you're like, hey, this actually is going to affect my presentation on stage. And maybe then if you're getting closer to your show, it does become more and more urgent, especially if the progress is not happening at the rate that you were hoping it would. So urgent, but not important. low priority that can be done if time permits. Delegate these tasks if possible. So this could be in the form of maybe you're not certain about your training methods. Maybe you're a little unclear of like, okay, well, is the way that I'm performing this exercise, is it optimal? Am I doing anything wildly wrong? This could be something that in turn you delegate to your coach. You outsource it. Maybe coaching as a whole is your ability to outsource. Maybe you're outsourcing the time it would take to then learn the skills of nutrition and training, because frankly, that's going to be very, very time consuming. And at this point, you want to delegate that off to a coach. And shoot, maybe this is the previous example. Maybe it's like, hey, I'm going to go take a class that works on overall, I don't know, like walking in heels, moving in heels. Maybe it's a dance class, maybe it's an etiquette class, maybe it's a pole class, like whatever that might be. Maybe that's something that's not necessarily a need, but you're like, okay, if I have the time, I will do this. This could also be like getting hair extensions. You're like, okay, I don't need to do this, but it could be something that overall enhances my presentation on stage. And I know I'm specifically talking about the competitors, so for non-competitors, maybe this is, I'm going to go spend time doing sauna, doing a cold plunge, of course in the case where this is not something you're reliant on to recover. But if you're like, hey, you know what, I think it would be worth spending a little bit of extra time. I'm not necessarily in pain and I'm not under recovered, but I think I would benefit by having a little more time spent towards recouping if time permits. All right, and final layer, final quadrant, neither urgent nor important. These can be categorized as distractions, tasks that impede progress. These tasks need to be eliminated. So I'll give you an example. The individual who historically has always used social media to derive inspiration, but they're getting close to their show and they're finding as they get more anxious, as they get more nervous, they are beginning to look up different hashtags relative to the show's name or the show's promoter or other people that are going to be competing at that same show. Potentially, they're going down social media rabbit holes, trying to find these physiques, finding girls that they are going to compete with, looking back to see how many calories they're eating, trying to see who coaches them, trying to see how they've done at previous shows. It sounds like a lot, but I can tell you, I've had clients come to me and they're like, hey, I am going to put a time limit on my time spent on Instagram on my phone because I'm finding that I'm being really unproductive on social media. And actually, it's making me feel worse getting off. Now, I think how you feel after looking at something on social media, I think that ultimately should be a really big clue to whether or not it's something you should be indulging in, especially if we're just talking about like doom scrolling. But in the case where you're not feeling better, in the case that you're only just looking at people's physiques and then kind of like beating the shit out of yourself emotionally because you're like, well, I don't look like that and I want to look like that, but I'm never going to look like that. If you're just in that spin cycle, it really might be worth intervening and trying to eliminate this as a part of your day-to-day, which even within this example, there's a lot of people who end up in this position, not intentionally. It's not like a task. They're like, oh, I need to go look at social media, but it does kind of weed its way into your day-to-day. And it can even be as simple as like, hey, when I go do cardio, I find for 60 minutes, I just look at other girls who are also in a similar division, similar height class, and I'm just making these really big comparisons. Within the space, this is something that is, I would say, standardized as common practice. It can be really toxic. It can be quite a headache. And I think in the case that you are continuing this repeated behavior where it is a distraction, I mean, I think you really have to ask, what else could you be doing with that time? Is there an activity that you could be doing that ultimately might make you feel better as opposed to making you feel worse, like this activity? I think to know how to even create a scoring system for your day-to-day, I think you really have to understand what the overarching goal actually is. So identifying, what do you want to look like and what needs to happen in order for you to look that way. Now, how do you want to feel too? Because you can take someone who is more of a recreational individual who is looking to compete. You can take someone who maybe has no aspiration to compete and just wants to continue to make progress within the constraints of their life. They have responsibilities within their family, within their career. They want to travel. Maybe they have future plans to continue building a family. These are all things that might dictate what magnitude you're able to, let me say that again, what level of effort and the time that can be put towards this goal. And I think being very clear about how much you're willing to provide that goal or give towards that goal, I think that's important from the get-go, because when you take someone who's like, hey, I'm looking to become a professional athlete, then I'm looking to compete actively as a pro, and then I'm looking to qualify for the Olympia, they are going to be experiencing different challenges and different feelings, and their task that, we might consider and be like, okay, well, the holiday season, like, that shouldn't necessarily be as urgent. Given their goals, it might be very important that they tend to that task, especially at the frequency that it requires. I think creating a scoring system that assigns weight to these tasks based on factors such as impact, effort, urgency, and alignment with your overall goal, I think is a very solid strategy to get a better understanding of what you need to do. And then once you have that understanding, once you have the actionables, then you can put them into practice. Now, I kind of already made the connection between the individual who maybe is looking to lose a little bit of body fat, but knows that they're probably going to need to build muscle as well at some point in the future. This is where I think the best way to get ahead of majority of people is to commit to eliminating these alternatives. Now, this is necessary regardless of the phase that you're starting with, whether you're starting with fat loss or you're starting with a growth phase. Either phase, you need to commit to eliminating the alternative, which is the other phase. The commitment to the phase that you're in is what's ultimately going to lead to more streamlined and an effective approach. And this is where I do think that you need to actively guide yourself and remind yourself, because it's okay that you're excited. It's okay that you might not be in your favorite phase. If you're someone who has a high propensity to build muscle, maybe you really like being in this build, but the diet itself sucks. It's really hard for you mentally, and you get really bogged down in the amount of weight that you're able to lift in the gym because it's not what you're used to. Or the alternative, you're in the build and you're like, you know what, this sucks. This is not what I want to do. This is really hard because I am actually moving away from the physique that I want to have, seemingly. I think by limiting and really capping the number of to-dos that you can do at once, and really identifying, like, can I lose fat and build muscle at the same time? The reality is you're not going to be able to do both effectively. You're not going to make progress in either direction in what I consider a meaningful way. And for me, when it comes to bodybuilding, one of the overarching principles has been efficiency and effectiveness of said phase. So in order to have a very effective phase, that means that I need to have tangible progress that can be measured. Now, in order for me to do this, I need to identify what are the alternatives that are impeding growth. Now, the third thing is addressing the most significant problem. Now, this often requires really deep analysis and effort, which is why many people opt for an easier task. A lot of people will fall into this position where they'll find that as they're getting into their fat loss phase, they're getting a little bit leaner, they're not holding on to muscle the way they thought they would. They may even be convinced that they're losing muscle. For a lot of people, they're not losing muscle, they're losing fat. They just never had the muscle that they thought they did in the first place. So with that, identifying that, like, hey, in order to achieve the physique that you want, in order to have the look that you're after, what you're going to need to do is spend time in a completely different phase, in quite literally the opposite phase, which is the build. That is what's going to allow you to put muscle on your physique, which ultimately is going to allow you to have the shape that you want, the preceding fat loss phase. So for the client that's trying to build muscle, this means prioritizing whatever needs to be done in order for them to actually build. Now, we need to break this down into the tasks that allow them to build. So the training stimulus, the food intake, as well as the recovery. Now, a lot of people that I've worked with, a lot of people out there will gravitate towards any of these variables that comes easy to them. It's pretty common to avoid the task that it's going to require the most work, which is why we need to make sure that we're eliminating these low priority tasks, or the ones that seemingly we can do with ease. Now, we have to consider the impact of said tasks. So in the case of the client who isn't training at the intensity they're supposed to, or not training in a way or executing the movements at a skill level that allows them to make meaningful progressions. This is someone who Absolutely. If their goal is to build muscle, we need to walk this back and we need to figure out why they're not able to replicate this with ease. Now, this can also be said for the client who is really focused on the minutia of their physique changes in the build. So someone who, let's say, is hyper-focused on the circumference of their waist meal to meal. The sensation of feeling full bothers them, so ultimately it drives them to undereat, even though their goal is to build muscle. They check in, they're like, well, I felt pretty heavy today and my clothes felt a little bit tighter, so I cut back on food. Sure, that biofeedback is helpful, and it's important as a coach to understand if your client's mentally struggling with that phase that they're in, but that person is also, in the same instance, missing the fact that they're continuing to undereat, putting them back into a deficit, making it to where now, going into their training, they're not able to perform as effectively. If this is something that I see as a coach manifest repeatedly, yet we're still seeing that initial behavior of them undereating based on how they feel or how they look in the mirror specific to their waist. This might be a conversation that I broach with them over their next check-in, like, hey, do you understand the consequences of these decisions that you're making and how they affect the overarching goal, the priority task, the critical task, which is to build muscle? This is why establishing mini check-ins and having frequent check-ins creates a sense of urgency and accountability for the client. Now, if you're coaching yourself, this might actually mean waking up and committing to taking pictures even if you don't feel your best. And before anyone gets on me, it's like, okay, well, what if I slept like shit? What if I didn't use the bathroom? What if I had a cheat meal the night before? Can I move my check-in? Yeah, you can move it to the following day. And I do tell clients, I'm like, hey, if you woke up, it was a bad night, you woke up, it's not reflective of the progress you've made, and you want to wait another day, that's okay. I understand it. What I'd like you to do is to for sure commit to doing it the following day, even if it's not fully representative of where you're at. I think this is why it's also important to have weekly targets in terms of the rate of change. Now, with measurements, depending on the phase that we're in, we might not see vast changes as we would with scale weight, but it's still something that we should be monitoring for regularly and assessing that trend bi-weekly or monthly. This is another reason that I like to have the accountability of the weekly sheets with my clients, where they are expected to fill out their water intake, their sleep, their step count, their gym performance. And gym performance is one that I see a lot of clients slip on because, frankly, it's not fun to report that you didn't get stronger this week. But if we're in a build and if you were complaining that the results aren't fast enough, well, we might be able to delineate some of the lack of results or slower results could be due to a lack of progression in training performance. This is also where something that I really like clients to do when we begin working together is to give me 1 or 2 days that they absolutely plan to check in. Previously, I've let people check in whenever they want. Sometimes they'll check in every 4 days, sometimes they'll check in every 8 days, and it became really cluttered, and it also gave people kind of too much leeway in the sense if they didn't feel like they'd made adequate progress, some of them wouldn't check in. They wouldn't check in until they had a question. So sometimes they would go 8, 10, 12 days without taking pictures. Then they would ultimately forget what the data that was supposed to be logged earlier in the week was, so they weren't able to provide that. I think having a set meeting every week where, hey, you're going to check in on this day, you're going to send me an email and let me know, at least within 24 hours, like, hey, check-in's running a little bit late, I'll have it to you tomorrow. I think having that standing meeting, or at least a standing day where we know, like, I'm obligated to check in, like this person is waiting on my check-in, this is when they plan to do my check-in. I think that's been a great strategy in order to increase accountability. Now, another thing that I'm a really big fan of that absolutely is a way to make sure that you get ahead of the competition is making visible progress and having clear and set expectations for what that progress will look like. I've had coaches who historically have just been like, we want to see fat loss. Obviously, we're in a fat loss phase or in prep. But I always kind of felt weird because I would check in and I would tell them what my weights were for the week, because the last coach I had was very consistent with like taking those 7-day scale weigh-ins, reporting them, but not really knowing, was this good enough? And granted, yes, some coaches, they do largely go off pictures, but I think with female athletes and I think with natural athletes and even athletes who are only mildly assisted, I definitely think it's something that we should be using as a we should be using as a pretty objective metric to determine if we are losing or gaining body fat. This is why I like having the timeline built out. I like clients to be able to see if we're starting a fat loss phase, hey, over the course of the next 12 weeks, if you're on track and if you lose at roughly 1% per pound of body weight, you will lose maybe 12 pounds minimally if we're shy of that, but you could lose closer to 15 pounds if you're on the money every week. This gives them a sense of motivation because they can see, hey, in 4 weeks, I will be down close to 6 pounds, or in 12 weeks, I will be down 15 pounds and I will feel like a completely different person. I think this transparency really helps develop that buy-in out the gate, which nothing is as frustrating as starting a program, not seeing results, having yet already changed and modified your behavior, your lifestyle. Maybe a lot of you, you probably have taken a complete 180 when you started your last diet, yet to only see very mild changes in your physique or in scale weight. I know for me, this would be really discouraging, and I wouldn't want to follow the program for very long if I failed to see objective results. Now, I know I already talked about eliminating alternatives, but I think really this is the crux of why people don't build muscle when they go into a growth phase. Lately, I've gotten pretty bold with the consultations that I've done where clients have come to me wanting to start a build phase and who are also concerned about fat gain. I just had a call this week. Girl was like, listen, I'm 13% body fat. I want to gain at the lowest rate of body fat gain that I can, but I want a lot more muscle. I want to do wellness. And within this, I was very honest with her. I was like, listen, fat gain is going to happen, and it will happen regardless of how successful we go about doing this phase. But the ways that we minimize fat gain, it's not going to be through anything other than you adhering to the program and making it your number one priority. The most critical task that you have at hand is getting stronger in the gym and doing everything outside of the gym that optimizes you getting stronger. So that means food, that means recovery, that means sleep, that means watching your step count and making sure you're going into these sessions properly fueled. And that's the thing. I don't like to hold hands with people that are pretty confident in their ability. I do typically want to see what someone can do without micromanaging. And in this case, if someone is very confident that hey, I can follow macros, I don't need a strict meal plan or something that is specific to certain meal timing. Okay, cool. Show me that you can execute responsibly. Show me that you can make reasonable decisions around food that will support your performance. And in that case, cool. I don't need to have my hands in it. You can be an adult, so you can be responsible with these choices, but it's at the point that performance starts to slip, or you start to complain about well, I'm not seeing those strength progressions, yet you are eating in a surplus. Well, that's when we would consider talking about how are you going about executing? How are you hitting these micronutrients? Are you considering other avenues that could be driving up fatigue, and when you are utilizing these in order to drive performance? Now, globally, with individuals who want to go into a build, the hardest part for them to wrap their mind around is that I want to see a 12 to 16 week commitment minimally. And it's not to say hey, you're going to do it and you're just going to suck it up regardless of what happens. There are different rates of change in which we will put in place depending on the person's comfortability. But for the person who is more conservative, if we're following a very mild rate of change per week, so less than half a pound per week relative to their average, 12 weeks isn't going to result in much of a shift. But if this is something that someone struggles with out the gate, what I have to explain to them is that you committed to it, but not for a long enough amount of time to see the progress. In 6 weeks, maybe at that point we ironed out all of the issues within training. Maybe we started to make incremental performance improvements so that you're able to get under heavier load. But you haven't been doing this long enough to really yield the results that you're hoping for. And frankly, with a build, I would rather have someone overshoot and spend more time in it, assuming body fat allows for that, than them pull out too quickly because they're uncomfortable. Now, when it comes to focusing on prioritizing tasks, I think this can significantly enhance the results that you get regardless of your phase. Now, if the overarching goal this week when you go to check in is to lose 1% of your body weight and you weigh 130 pounds, so that's 1.3 pounds this week. That means that on a daily basis, we need to be in over a 500 calorie deficit a day. So when we break this down into manageable items, what you can do is essentially create a checklist. Is there any chance that I wasn't in the specific deficit that I need today that ultimately will reduce the probability that I see that drop of 1% this week? Well, if we look at food reporting, that's a very easy one to check or to question. Are you eating foods that are pretty easy to track? Or are you making a lot of guesstimations? And I know a lot of people, they tend to criticize this and be like, well, you should have some flexibility as long as it's whole foods. Sure, but I think there's a lot of room for error here. And I think a lot of people, especially people with either dysregulated hunger signaling or very high, very strong hunger signaling, can tend to overdo it in these micronutrient dense foods in the hope to stave off some of that hunger, which is why I try to make it very clear with a client, like, hey, you can cook your food however you want. You can sous vide, you can pan fry, but you need to be very clear on if there are additives that have calories. And if you do add foods that have calories, you should be diligent in weighing out those oils, those sauces, those condiments, anything that could decrease the total overall food reporting for that day. Because the worst thing, and this is something I've definitely fallen into myself, is feeling like you've been dieting for a specific amount of time, only to realize that calories were significantly higher than you initially anticipated, which this, frankly, I think is what causes people to fail and ultimately fall off track. When we switch gears and look at a build, if you don't have a specific target for your build, if you don't know, hey, do I need to bring up this body part? Or is it more specifically, I need to have more glute med compared to glute max, or I want to have X number of inches on the circumference of my hips or the circumference of my shoulder, or I want to have a 1-to-1 ratio from my shoulders to my hips. And even though my waist might go up, I want it to stay under this threshold, all within reason. And I think this starts by addressing what those key problems are. So in the case for someone who structurally has smaller hips but fully developed shoulders, maybe their waist is an appropriate size for the ratios that they're after, but they want to have a more developed lower body. Okay, the key problems are that there is a deficit in lower body development, maybe even making it to where fat loss has to be pretty excessive in order to get overall balance. Still finding it hard to find balance in conditioning. See, in this case, this is someone that I would want to be very clear. How many inches do you want to add on your lower body, knowing that it's going to come down as you lose body fat? So in the case of someone who is 40 inches on their shoulders and then on their glutes to start out their build, they're maybe like 36. Okay, well, we have to know at their leanest, if their glutes are 36, the heaviest we need to get them to so that they are in 1-to-1 ratio with their shoulders is a little over 40. Because realistically, we're not going to retain 100% of that growth. Some of that is going to be body fat or fluid just from having a higher caloric intake as well as from inflammation. So within that, it's not enough to just shoot for 39 or 40 inches because realistically, if the goal is a 1-to-1 ratio, we need to have a few inches to spare that could very well and reasonably will come off with the fat loss phase. Now, what about in the case that you don't hit your goal? You have set out for, let's say you wanted to lose 15 pounds, you only lost 8, the allotted time has passed, and now this goal is uncompleted. And this is kind of what I alluded to for the individual who is not seeing objective progress, which I think can be a huge deterrent and ultimately a big detractor in your self-efficacy. In the case of someone who set out to lose a lot of weight and now they're ready to be done with the diet, but they didn't hit that target that they wanted. Well, you have to ask yourself the opportunity cost. Okay, well, if you were to continue with the fat loss phase, assuming that you're implementing the same strategy that you did before, which likely wasn't the best strategy, would it result in you hitting that target weight for the end of the fat loss phase? If the answer is no, then maybe the answer is to simply call it and move on, debrief, learn from your mistakes. But I think this comes down to understanding why the phase was not successful. It's okay if the phase isn't successful. And I think a lot of times people will tend to label these like it was good or it was bad, or I failed or I succeeded. And the reality is, even if you were just short of the target goal, but you did so in a very effective way, and you have now these new tools that you can exercise the next time you enter this phase, I do consider globally that to be a win. And I think that's a healthier way to approach uncompleted goals, or goals where you do fall short. What aspects can you learn from that experience? What things worked well? What things didn't? What was the limiting factor? What was the thing that held you back? Was it perhaps not prioritizing the big needle movers? And from those, which ones require the most urgency for you to be successful next time? I have clients who are very insistent. They want to compete. They know they're undersized. They would like to be in a position where they're actively on stage despite not being as dense as they'd like. Now, even for these clients who are very insistent, like they just want to be on stage, they're okay with making much slower progressions season to season. There's always a debrief and course correcting when we assess how their physique performed on stage. And this is something that it can be very constructive between you and your coach, but if you're self-coached or, you're new to working with your coach, it could be worth broaching like, hey, what are the things that I need to work on personally outside of just having more muscle? What are the things that ultimately held me back from making more progress this season? I think when you look at the wasted times and resources by not course correcting or learning from these mistakes, you very well could go into another season and do exactly what you did previously, and assuming that it wasn't optimal, it wasn't successful, you were just going to set yourself up to further waste time, your efforts, potentially impacting your health markers, which it more than likely will if we're talking about contest prep, but also the dietary fatigue that's accumulated for a result that you're not completely satisfied with. I don't think it's that hard to lose body fat or to build muscle. I think these processes are very simple, they're very straightforward, yet it's a lot of noise that gets in the way from individuals understanding what is holding them back. I think everything that we laid out here is something that you can at least take inventory of the aspects of your program that might not be as important, that maybe you're putting a lot of emphasis into, and which aspects, which big levers, which if you haven't looked at the podcast I have talking about the big 4 levers that are going to give you the most progress, definitely check that out. But if those are not being maximized, if you have not taken advantage of those, that's where the intention needs to go. And I'm sure between those 4, you can probably find one that is not being fully maximized, or one that is the least optimized that you can shift some attention to. I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, I will see you in the next one.